So last week I did a video where on camera I went through the process of adding a level select screen to the start of the game, and I was sort of talking about that in the context of like debug tools for myself to help make it easier to build the game and to test the game. I thought it was interesting though. A few days ago, Kotaku published an opinion piece in which the author was suggesting that all games should unlock every level from the start. It should be games should be closer to books or movies or music, where you have the media there, and if you want to skip directly to the end, you can do that. And since I just added this level select menu, I was sort of thinking, like, would that make sense for Gunmetal Arcadia? Or, well, probably not for Gunmetal Arcadia, since it's going to be randomly generated levels. But for Gunmetal Arcadia 0, since it will be a linear set of handcrafted levels, maybe it would make sense to just unlock all of those right from the start. So I'm not promising one way or the other yet, but it's something I've been thinking about, that since I already went through the process of making this level select menu, why don't I just ship the game with that? But what I wanted to do this week was follow up on a different side of last week's video, and that was as I was going through the process of implementing that menu, I ran into a few bugs. One of those was when I opened up one of my older test maps in the editor, the color palettes were all completely broken. And then the other one was, once I had the level select menu working, it would launch me into the correct map and into the correct room, but it would just place me in the upper left-hand corner of the screen at coordinates 0, 0, rather than looking for like a spawn point that I had placed in the editor. And I mentioned both of those as they happened on camera last week. Since then, I've gone back and fixed those bugs, but I thought it would be interesting, just I guess sort of for the sake of continuity, to take a look at why those things were happening, and how I fixed them. So I'll start with the one with spawning into the map at the wrong location, because that one was a little bit simpler, probably a little bit easier to explain, and the other one might be a little bit of a time sink once I get into it. But yeah, I'll go ahead and get started here. Let's see. So the issue, what was happening with the spawning into the map, goes back to some of the code that I wrote. I think this was originally written for Super Win the Game. Some of it may go back to You Have to Win the Game. As I was dealing with sort of separating out the notion of a campaign, which could be sort of an entire set of levels, from a map, which would be sort of one region of the game. Hi, cat. This week on Let's Make Gunmetal Arcadia, my cat. So as I was sort of figuring out what the distinction was between a campaign and a map, I was writing all this code to load into the game in the campaign you want, in the map that you want. And I think it was for Super Win the Game that I added the notion of debug spawn points, which the idea there was I wanted to be able to very quickly launch into the game, bypass any sort of intro splash screens, bypass the title screen, just launch the game and go directly into a map at a specific location. And specifically, this came from working with my editor, from wanting to be able to just like place a spawn point in the editor and click play and launch right into the game at that point. So I had this notion of debug spawn points, which were separate from regular spawn points, which would be the location where the player actually spawns when they start the game for the first time, or when they walk into a new area. And what I did was I looked for these debug spawn points, and I would only consider those to be valid spawn locations when I was actually launching the game using command line parameters to jump to a specific point. Sorry, I need to pause for a second because my cat is making a lot of noise and it's distracting me. So after I released Super Win the Game and I started working on Gunmetal Arcadia, I went back and I cleaned up a lot of the code related to loading maps and sort of condensed where I had a number of different code paths for things like launching into the game from command line parameters, starting a new game from the title screen, loading a saved game, moving between rooms. Just when you walk to the edge of the room, it scrolls over, versus teleporting to a room, either by jumping through a physical teleporter or pressing up when you're in front of a doorway or something like that. I had a few different code paths all over the place, and I tried to condense those down as much as possible into this function called primary room load. So this takes in the name of the map that you want to be in, a position within that map, and a few other parameters, and does whatever it needs to do to put you in that room. If it needs to load a new map, it will do that. If not, it will just stick with the map that it has and take you to the correct place. One of the parameters here, the fourth parameter, is a reference to an array of what I call debug start handles. And basically this is a handle to an entity that may exist somewhere in the map, which is a debug spawn location. Now, this code here, this is my onSelected campaign function. This is what typically would run when you either when you start a new game from the title screen or when you load a previously played game. But this would not run if you were launching the game from command line parameters, which also includes launching the game from the editor. And at the time, as of last week, what I would do is I would just create an empty array of handles here, and pass that in as my set of debug spawn points. And so what would happen is it would say, okay, there's a spawn point here, but I don't want to actually consider that as a valid spawn location. To give you an example of another place where this is used, let's see, if I look for a quick start, this is where I can launch the game from command line parameters. I do call primary room load here again, but in this case I'm passing in these debug start handles, which are, I think these are enumerated when, I actually don't remember when they're enumerated. I guess it's when the player loads into a room. Oh, here it is. Oh, right. This makes more sense. So I can have entities that have this debug start component on them, and when those get created or destroyed, they register themselves with the game as a debug spawn point. So when I load into that room, it loads all the entities in that room, and some of those may be these spawn points that I used for debugging purposes, and they would register themselves and say, hey, I'm available. But then the only code that was actually using that was the quick start code. Once these have been registered with the game, then it would pass those along and say, hey, consider these as valid spawn locations also. And for the normal case of launching into the game from the title screen, I would just create this empty array and pass that, and so it would always ignore those points. Of course, now that I have the level select menu and I'm using that for sort of debugging purposes, I want to be able to use any of those spawn points. So what I did here was I just added the condition that if I'm not trying to, whoa, what's going on there? My mouse wheel is getting twitchy. If I'm not trying to continue from a previous saved game, and I am trying to load into the room, either into the room that's specified as the starting point of a map or into the map that's specified as the starting point of a campaign, then it will use whatever debug spawn points are available in that room. It will consider those to be valid spawn points. So that it was really just one line of code here to say, like, do I want to use the stuff that's already available to me here, and that fixed that bug. So I'll show what that looks like now. If I launch the game and go to one of my test maps here. Previously, what we saw in last week's video was that it would spawn me into the upper left-hand corner. this time it puts me on the ground correctly. And if I come over here and launch my editor, just to sort of go ahead and complete that loop here, I'll show that there is in fact a spawn point at that location. Oops, I just loaded the wrong campaign. So that was in the default map, probably room 00, I believe. Yeah, so there is a debug spawn point there, and that's the one that spawns me at. So that was a fairly easy bug to fix. Took just a couple minutes of investigation to figure out like why it should have this data available to it. Like I knew that spawn point clearly existed, and it would be recognized when I quick launched into the game. So it was a question of why is it not taking advantage of this thing that clearly exists and that the game knows about. And well, it made sense once I saw it. It was like, well, there was a code there that was sort of voluntarily ignoring that data. So the other bug was a little bit trickier to solve. It was one that I understood why it was happening, but I sort of had to come up with a good solution that not only would fix the issue that I was seeing, but prevent it from occurring again in the future. So what was happening last week was, and you can go back and check last week's video if you want to see what this actually looked like. Unfortunately, I don't have a build here that would show that off. But what happened was when I loaded one of my older campaigns in the editor, and in fact it was the one that I just opened here by mistake a second ago, all of the color palettes were completely broken. So I think, for instance, the bricks here that are supposed to be brown, those were like bright cyan. The background that's supposed to be sort of this dark teal was, I don't remember what color that was, but the palettes were all completely broken. And I understood what was happening there. It was an issue of color palettes being thrown out of sync because I had changed my other campaign data. But to sort of explain exactly what's happening, I need to dig a little bit deeper into exactly how some of my data is structured. So I've talked in the past about how I have kernel data, which is sort of central data that's common to every campaign I might want to make. And then I have campaign data, which typically will include things like maps, but it could include, entities if I wanted to add like a new type of enemy or a new character in DLC at some point down the road. I could make those be specific to that campaign. So those are only available once that campaign is loaded. Now, both the kernel and any campaign are allowed to specify color palettes, and I refer to those as subpalettes in here. Subpalette meaning that it's a subset of the complete NES color palette, and also to differentiate it from tile sets, which I also called palettes, going back to I think You Have to Win the Game was where I started using that terminology. If I were rebuilding this all from scratch today, I would call these things tile sets, because that's really what they are. This is the thing that defines all these little pieces up here that I can then build into prefabs and sort of stamp into the map scene. I would call those things tile sets, and then these things down here could just be palettes, which they are, but I've called them sub-palettes to help differentiate those. So, for instance, these are I have my little bug enemy, and he's greenish, so he has several shades of green here. So both the kernel and any campaign are allowed to define these subpalettes, and you'll see some of these have an asterisk next to them. That means it's kernel data. That means that it's common to any campaign that I build for this game. If I scroll down further, you'll see some of these do not have an asterisk next to them, including some of these that I've marked as the capital E and V is environment. I was tagging some of these that way so I could just more quickly see what palettes I was wanting to use for the environment. So, for instance, this I think Cave Brown. This is the one that's on some of these brown tiles. I think the Dank one is the yeah, that's the background, the blue bricks. So I have the palettes specified in the kernel and the campaign, and then I'll just go ahead and launch a second instance of my editor here so I can I'll launch a second instance of my editor so I can show what this looks like for my other campaign. This is more recent test maps specifically for Gunmetal Arcadia 0. Here I of course have all the same palettes that are part of the kernel because this is using the same kernel. But then down here I have one or two other palettes that are specific to this campaign. So those get saved to an XML file. Let's see. I'll go ahead and open this here real quick. Let's drag this over. What those look like is, yeah, I have subpalettes, and those have a name, and then they have a number of indices associated with them, and these are indices into the NES color palette. So those should be values between 0 and 55, I think, something like that. Yeah, they can also have metadata and tags and a few other things associated with them, as all resources in my editor can. But basically, the important things are the name and the indices, because that defines one of these palettes. So this is the campaign file for the older test campaign. It defines some subpalettes here. If I go to my kernel, I can look at that, and it's basically the same sort of markup in this one. And this one defines all of its own subpalettes as well. Now, the reason this bug was occurring is because that data gets written to the markup here, but I also save subpalette data to a binary format so that the game can load it more quickly. And what was happening was when new subpalettes would be added or removed in the kernel, it was throwing off offsets in the subpalettes defined in the campaign if those changes were made in the other campaign. So I have these two campaigns, and I make changes in one, and that messes up the indices that have been saved in the other, because it has basically it just makes a numbered list of all these subpalettes and references them by number. So I think it's what order they were added in. It's a very, very simple format just for cooking things down to binary data that I can load more quickly. But yeah, that was basically the issue. Was I would make changes in one campaign, it would throw off the indices in the other. So because I had added, I think, one or two new subpalettes to the kernel from my newer campaign, when I would go load the other one, it would look for indices, and they would be off by 2. Because every number had been incremented by 2, so it was like it was looking at the wrong place in the list. So I sort of understood intuitively that was what was happening, because I had seen a few similar problems when I first started implementing these palette swapping features. I sort of knew what to expect those to look like. But then the question was, okay, how do I fix this? Not only fix this one case, because yeah, my indices are off, and I can look and see, okay, I know where they broke and by how much they're being offset, so I can fix that. But in the future, how do I make sure that if I make changes to one campaign, it doesn't break another one? And what I ended up doing was honestly a very, very simple fix here. Yeah, I guess it's not this one. Yeah, so what I did is I added this base equals 36. Basically what this says is this campaign understands that when it was saved, it believed the kernel specified 36 subpalettes of its own. So this campaign is beginning its indices from the number 36. When the campaign gets loaded, it will load the kernel first, and then we'll look at this data and say, does this match the number of subpalettes that the kernel has provided? If it does, then everything's fine. We don't need to change anything. But if they don't match, then we need to say, okay, the kernel has changed, probably because another campaign changed it. So we need to update any of our own subpalettes. We need to offset those indices by some amount, one direction or the other, depending on whether the kernel added or removed subpalettes. And that's really all it does. Is it just saves off the number of subpalettes that it expects the kernel to have provided, and does this simple arithmetic fix up. And it's fairly simple, once I explain it like that. And but getting to that point took some doing, and what I ended up doing, on the way to getting to that point, was added some new tools so that I could better understand when things were broken, how exactly they were broken. And one of those things was, I would load up a map, and the color palettes would be all messed up. I would go, okay, the color palettes are broken, but how are they broken? Like, I kind of intuitively understood that everything was offset by some value at some certain point, but to understand, like, how far is it offset, I didn't really have good tools for visualizing that sort of thing. So what I've done now is I've added a tooltip, so I can hover over any tile here, and it will show. So I have these. I have this layer 0, 1, and 2, and that's distant background, and foreground layers. Distant background is things, for instance, that would exist behind crumbling bricks and stuff like that. Background constitutes most of what you see in the scene, and then foreground is things that will be drawn on top of the player. So I can have sort of a stack of tiles in 3 dimensions there. And if I hover over a tile, it will just pop up a tooltip real quick that will show me everything that's in there. It will tell me where that tile comes from. So, for instance, this one is coming from a palette that's called Cave Palette, and that's this one up here. And it will tell me what subpalettes it's using, which is this Cave Brown. And then it also has that number 43 there, and that's the index that the Brown Cave subpalette is saved with. The second part of that was understanding, or wanting tools to visualize better how these subpalettes are being indexed when it does create that numbered list. So for instance, that one's number 43. I can come down here now to this Cave Brown palette and look at that here. You'll see it shows index 43, but then it also shows what the previous palette is and what the next palette is. So the previous one is this environment ice. If I come and look at that one, this is black, cyan, and white. And in fact, when the color palettes were broken the other day, this is the color palette that it was using on all these tiles. So what that was telling me was everything is offset by one index, starting from whatever number of subpalettes the kernel had defined. So having some of these tools here to understand how my data was being arranged for preparation for that binary file format helped me to figure out what a good solution was for fixing this so it doesn't occur in the future, so that I could come up with that solution of doing a sort of automatic fix-up step if we understand, as we're loading the campaign, that, hey, something else changed, we have some data that we don't expect, let's automatically fix ourselves up. So, actually, I can show an example of how that works now on camera too. Let's see, I'll go ahead and close this one real quick and run the editor again, jump into my newer test map, and what I'll do is I'll just sort of go through the steps of what would have created this error before. If I add a new subpalette, I'll just do something bright pink here. So I have this neon pink subpalette, and by default it creates subpalettes as kernel data. I think maps are the only thing that are by default created as campaign data. Um, and then let's see, just to make sure that works, I will go ahead. Where did that one go? I probably need to like alphabetize this list or something. Oh, actually, this may be a bug of its own, and maybe next week I can do a follow up here. I think that new subpalette is not showing up in this list yet. I probably need to repopulate that list anytime the subpalettes change. I'm not sure what I would have to do to prompt that to change. Probably if I just save and reload org. Alright, so yeah, now I do have this neon pink subpalette here, and I can come down here and paint that onto these tiles. I do actually have tools for painting larger regions at once, so I have to go over every single tile. Yeah, like if I select a region like this, and then come up here and select a palette, then I can paint with sort of larger stamps of that size. So I do that, I jump into the game. It should work fine once I'm in here. Yes, that palette does show up correctly. So that's exactly the sort of use case that would have created errors in the past. What would have happened then is if I went and loaded my older test campaign, all of those indices would be offset by 1 again, and you would see, it would be using that ice palette for all the bricks here. But in this case, it understood, the kernel was saved with a different number of subpalettes than we expected, so it automatically applied that offset and fixed itself up, and we get exactly the things that we expect here. And of course now, because I've added that neon pink subpalette to the kernel, I can come in here and paint over all of these with that. I'm not sure why I'd want to. That does not look very good. But yeah, I guess that's the high level overview of why that bug was happening and what I did to fix it. Oh, right, now this isn't really a bug. My slimes are stationary right now because I had I was taking screenshots and I just wanted them to sit in place. I think if I just do a full recompile, that should fix itself. Maybe that's a bug. So what's happening there is, even though I didn't commit those changes to make the slimes just hover in place like that, when I reverted it, the game still thinks, the game doesn't understand that file was sort of changed by means of reverting it, so it doesn't think that it needs to recompile the slimes. So even though I've reverted them to an old form, it's still using the newer one that I had modified to make them hover in place. Now that I recompile everything, I start up and they're moving around and animating as usual. So maybe I need to add some handling for that case. I don't know, maybe I just do like a hash check or something, as well as a timestamp check to make sure that the data is really in the form I expect it to be in. But that's pretty much all that I wanted to show this week. I guess a little bit of a shorter video as far as work videos go, but I'm not doing any actual development this time, so that makes sense, I guess. This may be the last sort of normal video I do for a while. I'm planning to have something ready to go next week, but I'm going to be taking some time off for paternity leave, and I don't yet know exactly how my blogging and video production schedule is going to be impacted by that. So, I'm still going to be working as much as I'm able because that's what I do. But yeah, I don't know for sure that I will have a full-fledged video ready to go next week or the week after that, or but definitely stay tuned to my Twitter because I will be posting pretty much everything I do on there. And yeah, I guess thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.